There is a pattern in the Bible that almost nobody talks about, not because it's hidden, because it's hiding in plain sight in so many stories that most people assume it's a coincidence. And once you see it, you will find it in every major transition God brings his people through, from Genesis to Revelation. Here is the pattern in one sentence. Every major transition God orchestrates has 4 distinct phases, and almost everyone in the middle of a transition is misreading which phase they're in, which means they're applying the wrong response at exactly the wrong time. Joseph went through it. Moses went through it. Jacob went through it. Abraham went through it. Ruth went through it. Paul went through it. Different centuries, different cultures, different callings. Same 4 phases every time. And here is what makes this pattern so important. When you understand where you are inside it, the confusion doesn't disappear, but it changes shape. It goes from feeling random to feeling purposeful, from feeling like loss to feeling like preparation, from feeling like God has forgotten you to feeling like God is, in fact, in the middle of exactly what he said he would do. Let's go through the 4 phases. Before we get to the phases, there's one observation that holds the whole pattern together. Look at what happens to people's names in the Bible right around the time of a major transition. Abram becomes Abraham. Sarai becomes Sarah. Jacob becomes Israel. Joseph receives the Egyptian name Zaphanath-Paneah. Hoshea becomes Joshua. And in the New Testament, Simon becomes Peter. Saul becomes Paul. In the ancient world, a name change was not cosmetic. It was not a rebrand. Your name in the Hebrew understanding was the distillation of your identity, who you were, what you were made for, where you were going. And when God changed someone's name, it was because the person who was about to walk into the next chapter was not the same person who had been living in the previous one. The name change was the announcement. A new identity is being formed. And that new identity almost never arrives without a transition that is painful, disorienting, and long. What God is doing in every major transition is not primarily changing your circumstances. He is changing you. The new circumstances are just where the new you needs to operate. And the transition, the long, painful, confusing space in between, is where the actual work happens. Here are the 4 phases of that work. The first phase is the disruption. And it almost never feels like it's coming from God. The disruption is the moment when something ends without your permission. A door closes. A relationship fractures. A plan collapses. A season you expected to last longer simply stops. And because it feels like loss, because in the immediate moment it often is loss, most people do not recognize the disruption as the opening movement of something God is doing. They recognize it as something going wrong, as attack or failure or abandonment. Abraham's disruption came in Genesis 12, when God said, "Leave your country, your kindred, your father's house, everything familiar, everyone he had built his life around. No destination given, just a direction. Go." At 75 years old, into the unknown. That is not a gentle invitation. That is a disruption of an entire life. Moses' disruption came the day he killed the Egyptian who was beating a Hebrew slave. He had lived as a prince of Egypt for 40 years. In one moment, everything unraveled. He fled to the desert. The palace was gone. The identity was gone. The future he had assumed was gone. Joseph's disruption was the most violent. Thrown into a pit by his brothers and sold to slave traders at 17 years old. In a single afternoon, his family, his freedom, and his future were taken simultaneously. Here is what these 3 disruptions have in common. None of them were the end of the story, but all of them felt like it. And here is the diagnostic for phase 1. A disruption sent by God almost always strips something from you that you had been relying on instead of him, not to punish you, to reorient you, to remove the thing that was anchoring you to the old identity so the new one has somewhere to take root. The question to ask in the disruption is not, why is this happening to me? The question is, what was I relying on that God is removing? Because the answer to that question reveals what the next phase is going to build. The second phase is the wilderness, and it is the longest phase and the most misread. The wilderness is what comes after the disruption but before the resolution. It is the in-between place, the threshold, the space where what was has ended but what's next hasn't arrived yet. Moses spent 40 years here, literally in the desert, herding sheep after leaving Egypt. 40 years of ordinary, invisible, seemingly inconsequential work in a place nobody was watching, in a role that carried none of the dignity of a prince of Egypt. Joseph spent roughly 13 years in the wilderness between the pit and the palace. First as a slave in Potiphar's house, then as a prisoner in Pharaoh's jail. 13 years in which nothing he could see pointed to his dreams coming true. Jacob's wilderness was 14 years working for Laban, the uncle who cheated him, manipulated him, switched his bride on his wedding night, and changed his wages 10 times. 14 years of deception and delay in a foreign land. And here is the pattern inside the wilderness that almost nobody talks about. The wilderness is where the new identity gets built, not announced, not celebrated, built slowly, invisibly, in the most ordinary and unglamorous of circumstances. Moses in the desert was not wasting time. He was learning to be a shepherd. He was learning patience that no palace could have taught him. He was learning the topography of the very wilderness he would later lead 2 million people through. Every skill, every habit of dependence on God, every dimension of character that the prince of Egypt had not developed was being built in the shepherd of Midian. Joseph, in Potiphar's house, was not spinning his wheels. He was learning to be faithful when no one was watching, learning to govern a household before he would govern a nation, learning that integrity in small things is the prerequisite for authority over large ones. Jacob, working for Laban, was not simply being exploited. He was being slowly, painfully emptied of the manipulative self-reliance that had defined him his entire life. Jacob had spent decades getting what he wanted through cleverness, stealing a birthright, deceiving his father, outmaneuvering everyone around him. The wilderness with Laban was where that strategy stopped working, where Jacob encountered someone more cunning than himself and could not outwit his way through, and in that powerlessness, something began to crack open. The diagnostic for the wilderness is this: things are not moving at your pace. You are doing what's right, and the results are not coming. The work feels too small for what you believe you're called to, and time, more time than seems reasonable, keeps passing. If that is where you are, the question God is asking is not, when will this end? He is asking, who are you becoming while you wait? The third phase is the wrestling. And this is the phase most people don't even know exists. After the disruption, after the long wilderness, just before the resolution, there is almost always a moment of direct, personal confrontation where God asks you to surrender the last thing you've been holding back, the deepest identity, the most protected version of self, the final resistance. Jacob's wrestling is the most literal picture of this in all of Scripture. He had spent 14 years in Laban's wilderness. He had finally been released. He was on his way back to Canaan, and then he received word that Esau, the brother he had deceived, the brother who had sworn to kill him, was coming to meet him with 400 men. Jacob was afraid. He divided his family and possessions into groups, hoping some would escape if Esau attacked. He prayed. He sent gifts ahead to appease Esau. And then, that night, alone at the ford of the Jabbok, a man appeared and wrestled with him until daybreak. Genesis 32-24 is one of the strangest verses in the entire Old Testament. And Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until the breaking of the day. They wrestled all night. And the man, who was not only a man, who was divine, could not prevail against Jacob. So he touched Jacob's hip socket, and it was put out of joint. And still Jacob held on. And the man said, "Let me go, for the day is breaking." And Jacob said, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." And the man asked, "What is your name?" Jacob said, "Jacob." And the man said, "Your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel, for you have striven with God and with men, and have prevailed." Now read what just happened very carefully. The question, "What is your name?" is not a request for information. God knows his name. The question is forcing Jacob to declare his identity out loud, Jacob, which means supplanter, deceiver, the one who grabs the heel. That is who he had been for his entire life, and in declaring it, in saying the name out loud, in the dark, at the moment when he was most desperate and most vulnerable, he was finally being honest about who he actually was. And that honesty was the precondition for the new name. You cannot receive Israel while you are still performing Jacob. The wrestling phase is the moment God asks you to be completely honest about who you have been, not to shame you, not to condemn you, but because the new identity cannot be placed on top of the old one. The old name has to be acknowledged, owned, and surrendered before the new name can be given. The diagnostic for the wrestling phase is a crisis that feels out of proportion. It arrives when you thought you were almost through, when the resolution seemed close, and it confronts you with something you cannot solve through your usual methods, your intelligence, your competence, your self-reliance, because those are exactly what need to be surrendered. Jacob walked away from that wrestling match with a limp. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. That limp was not a punishment. It was a memorial, a permanent physical reminder of the night he stopped being Jacob and started being Israel. Some things God does in a transition leave a mark, not because he is cruel, because the mark becomes the testimony. The fourth phase is the resolution, and it almost never looks like what you expected. The resolution is the moment the new identity comes fully into expression, but it carries with it everything from the prior three phases: the stripping of the disruption, the character built in the wilderness, the surrender of the wrestling. It is not a fresh start. It is a full arrival. Joseph's resolution came with a razor and a change of clothes. He shaved, dressed in clean garments, and walked into Pharaoh's throne room. By sundown he was wearing Pharaoh's signet ring and a gold chain around his neck, riding in a chariot and governing Egypt. But notice what Joseph said about his two sons, born in Egypt during the long years before the resolution. He named the first son Manasseh. "For God has made me forget all my hardship and all my father's house." He named the second son Ephraim, "For God has made me fruitful in the land of my affliction." Those two names are the testimony of a man who passed through all four phases, forget and fruitful. The wilderness was real enough that he named a son after the forgetting of it, and the resolution was real fruitful in the very place of his affliction. The resolution does not erase what came before. It redeems it. Abraham's resolution was not just a son. It was the founding of a covenant that would run for all of human history. Moses' resolution was not just leading Israel out of Egypt. It was 40 more years of the most intimate relationship with God recorded in the Old Testament, a man God spoke to face, as a man speaks with his friend. Jacob's resolution was reunion with Esau, restoration to Canaan, and eventually seeing his son Joseph alive and ruling Egypt, the fulfillment of everything that had seemed to die in the pit at Dothan. But here is what every resolution has in common. It requires you to be the person the transition built. The 17-year-old Joseph, who bragged about his dreams to his brothers, could not have stood before Pharaoh. The prince of Egypt could not have led the Exodus. The conniving Jacob could not have fathered the 12 tribes of Israel. The resolution is not a reward given to the person who suffered. It is a responsibility given to the person who was transformed. Before I close, I need to say one thing carefully. These 4 phases are not a guaranteed timeline you can calculate. They are a pattern, not a promise, that every transition ends in a visible, earthly resolution. John the Baptist went through disruption, wilderness, and wrestling. His resolution was dying in prison, having introduced the Messiah to the world. Jeremiah went through all 4 phases, and his ministry was largely rejected during his lifetime. His resolution was that his words outlasted every king who ignored him, and that he is still speaking to millions of people today. The resolution God has for you may not be the one you're picturing. It may be larger than what you're expecting. It may look entirely different from what you assumed. It may arrive in a form that requires eternity to fully see. But the pattern holds. God does not waste a single phase. Every disruption strips something that needed to go. Every wilderness builds something the next chapter requires. Every wrestling confronts the identity that has to be surrendered for the new one to be received. So where are you? If you are in the disruption, if something has just ended without your permission, the question is not, why did this happen? The question is, what was I leaning on that God is removing so I can lean on Him instead? If you are in the wilderness, if you are doing what's right and nothing is moving, the question is not, when will this end?